That spring belongs to the community now." Vanessa Cole said it without raising her voice, as though repeating something often enough could turn theft into policy. She stood at the edge of my meadow in spotless white shoes, one hand resting on a leather clipboard, while an excavator tore a 6-foot trench through land my father had owned for 43 years. A black irrigation pipe already ran from the trench toward Cedar Ridge's golf course. Behind the machine, water from my private spring was disappearing into a portable pump faster than the channel could refill. I asked Vanessa to show me the permit. Instead, she handed me a yellow violation notice. According to the paper, I was interfering with emergency drought infrastructure and threatening the financial stability of the community on my own land. I didn't yell, I didn't touch the machine, and I didn't give her the argument she had clearly come prepared to record. I photographed the trench, the pump, the contractor's truck, and the orange survey stakes lying broken beside the excavator tracks. Then I walked to the cedar post near the spring and removed the memory card from my wildlife camera. Vanessa had no idea that the camera had recorded her contractor entering my property at 1:17 that morning. She also didn't know that the spring was covered by a senior water rights certificate carrying my name. But neither of those facts was the reason federal and state inspectors would soon shut down every irrigation pump on her golf course. 12 years earlier, my father had helped document that wet meadow as a breeding site for a protected frog. 4 days after Vanessa handed me that violation notice, government vehicles rolled across the 18th fairway during Cedar Ridge's largest charity tournament of the year. By sunset, the pumps were sealed. The HOA was facing penalties of up to $10,000 for every day it failed to comply, and Vanessa was being asked why her brother's construction company had received emergency funds without a board vote. But that morning, she still believed I was just an old man standing between her and free water. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Daniel," she said. The excavator bucket struck the ground again, sending a tremor through my boots. The contractor had cut directly across the shallow swale my father and I had restored, after a wildfire stripped the hillside bare. Native grass had once held the soil together there. Now muddy water spilled down the fresh cut and collected around the machine's tracks. "This project stops until you show me a county permit, a water withdrawal authorization, and a recorded easement," I said. Vanessa gave me the patient smile people use when they think they're speaking to someone too slow to understand them. The board approved an emergency resolution. The HOA board doesn't own this parcel. We have authority over resources that affect community property values. That isn't an easement. She tapped the clipboard against her palm. The golf course is the economic heart of Cedar Ridge. If it dies, everyone's home value suffers. Your little stream carries more water than you could ever use. My little stream. That was what she called the spring my father had spent 20 years protecting. One of the board members standing behind her avoided looking at me. The other held up his phone, recording. Vanessa pointed toward the pump. "If you interfere with HOA equipment, we'll hold you personally liable for the damage. We may also ask the sheriff to remove you from the work zone." For a moment, even the contractor stopped moving. He knew where he was standing. I looked down at the yellow notice. Vanessa had signed it herself beneath the title President, Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. Then I noticed something she probably hoped I would miss. The project map clipped behind the notice showed my spring, the trench, and the irrigation line. But it did not show my property boundary. The orange survey stakes that marked it had been pulled from the ground and thrown into the weeds. That was when I understood this had not begun that morning. Someone had surveyed my spring. Someone had planned the pipe route, and someone had decided the easiest way to steal the water was to erase the line showing who owned it. I folded the violation notice, slipped it into my shirt pocket, and stepped away from the excavator. Vanessa smiled as if I had surrendered. I let her believe that, because the one thing my father taught me about water disputes was simple. Never argue beside the ditch. Go home and open the records. The sound of the excavator followed me across the meadow, metal against stone, then the mechanical groan of the pump pulling water where it had no right to go. My house sat on 22 acres just beyond Cedar Ridge's northern boundary. It wasn't part of the HOA. It had never been part of the HOA. My father bought the land in 1981, long before the golf course, the stone entrance signs, or the rows of oversized homes with identical mailboxes. Back then, the property was mostly scrub, burned timber, and damaged soil. A wildfire had stripped the hillside several years earlier, and every heavy rain sent mud into the spring channel. My father spent decades rebuilding it by hand. He planted willow along the banks. He stacked stone where the current cut too deeply. He fenced cattle away from the wet meadow and taught me how to measure flow with a marked pole, a stopwatch, and patience. He never called himself an environmentalist. He was a pipe fitter who hated waste. To him, protecting water was simply what a landowner was supposed to do. I followed the same trade before becoming a municipal water systems engineer. For 31 years, I designed pump stations, reviewed drainage plans, and testified when contractors tried to hide bad work beneath clean paperwork. That was probably why Vanessa disliked me. I knew the difference between an emergency project and theft dressed up with technical language. The spring wasn't large. At its widest point, it was barely 12 feet across, but it ran cold even in August and fed a chain of shallow pools before leaving my property. My father used to sit beside the upper pool every Sunday morning. After he died, I kept his old folding chair in the shed. Vanessa saw a free source of irrigation. I saw the last place on the property that still carried his fingerprints. Inside the house, I placed the yellow violation notice on the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Before checking the county records, I pulled up the live camera feed from the spring. The water level had already dropped nearly 4 inches. Then I noticed a second pipe disappearing beneath the grass near the lower fence. It was older than the trench they had dug that morning. The ground above it had already settled. That meant Vanessa's crew hadn't started stealing my water today. They had only stopped hiding it. Cedar Ridge had been built around its golf course. Every brochure showed the same image: bright green fairways curving between expensive homes, a stone clubhouse beside a blue irrigation pond, and smiling couples holding glasses of wine beneath the words, "Luxury living in harmony with nature." That summer, nature had stopped cooperating. The county had received less than half its normal rainfall. Water restrictions were in effect, and the city had raised commercial irrigation rates for the 3rd time in 6 months. From my upper field, I could see brown patches spreading across the fairways. The irrigation pond behind the clubhouse had dropped so low that a dark ring of mud surrounded it. Several fountains had been shut off, and maintenance crews were watering only the greens and the areas visible from the main road. Vanessa had a bigger problem than dead grass. Cedar Ridge's annual charity golf tournament was 3 weeks away. The event brought in sponsors, real estate agents, county officials, and prospective buyers. Vanessa treated it like her personal campaign rally. She gave speeches, posed for photographs, and reminded everyone that property values had risen during her years as HOA president. Brown fairways would make her look incompetent. A special assessment would make residents angry. Canceling the tournament would make both problems public. So Vanessa promised the board she could restore the course without raising dues. According to the meeting summary posted online, she described her solution as a temporary water-sharing arrangement with adjacent land. My land. There had never been an arrangement. I searched through the HOA's public meeting notices. 2 weeks earlier, Vanessa had called a closed emergency session about landscape preservation. The minutes contained only one approved expense: $48,000 for drought mitigation. The contractor was listed as Cole Environmental Solutions. Vanessa's last name was Cole. I searched the state business registry. The company belonged to Marcus Cole, her younger brother. That explained the pipe, the midnight work, and the missing survey stakes. But a project like this required measurements: elevation, pipe length, pump capacity, and the flow rate of the spring. Someone had been taking readings. I opened the oldest camera footage still stored on my computer and began moving backward. 9 days before the excavation, a man wearing a Cedar Ridge maintenance shirt had crossed my fence with a measuring wheel. 3 days later, he returned with Vanessa. She pointed toward the spring, then toward the golf course pond. Before leaving, she photographed the metal water right marker beside the upper pool. Vanessa had seen the marker. She knew the spring was private. She had simply decided the golf course needed it more. I copied every camera file onto an external drive, made a second copy, and uploaded everything to cloud storage. Years of reviewing failed infrastructure projects had taught me one rule: evidence only exists if it survives the person who wants it gone. The most important clip began at 1:17 in the morning. Headlights appeared beyond the lower fence. A white work truck stopped beside the locked service gate, and 2 men stepped out wearing dark jackets with the logo of Cole Environmental Solutions. One examined the chain. The other cut it. They drove onto my property without hesitation. The camera's infrared view showed them unloading a measuring laser, marking paint, and several coils of black pipe. They moved like men following a plan they already understood. At 1:42, one of them found the orange survey stake near the spring. He pulled it from the ground, checked the label, and tossed it into the truck. Then he removed 2 more. At 2:06, another vehicle arrived. Vanessa stepped out wearing rubber boots and a long coat. She walked directly to the upper pool, pointed across the meadow, and traced a line with her flashlight toward the golf course. The audio was faint, but one sentence came through clearly. "Keep the intake below the marker, he won't see it from the house." I replayed that line 3 times. Vanessa had not relied on a mistaken map. She had not misunderstood the property boundary. She had deliberately chosen a location she thought I would not notice. The next clip showed the crew burying a narrow intake pipe beneath the grass. They covered the trench, brushed loose soil across the tire tracks, and replaced the chain with a cheaper lock. That was the older pipe I had found on the live feed. For at least a week, they had been siphoning water at night. The large trench and portable pump were only the final stage. I drove back to the meadow with a camera, measuring tape, and sample bottles. The excavator had stopped for lunch, but the pump was still running. I photographed its serial number and the flow rating stamped on the side. At full capacity, it could move nearly 400 gallons a minute. The spring could not sustain anything close to that. Near the lower channel, several minnows were trapped in shallow pockets of warming water. Mud from the new trench had spread over the gravel bed, where the current normally ran clear. I marked the waterline against a flat stone and took my first measurements. Then I followed the black pipe toward the fence. It disappeared underground, crossed beneath the service road, and continued under the edge of the golf course. The grass above it had been cut into a narrow strip and rolled back into place. Someone had installed that section days earlier, maybe longer. I was photographing the disturbed ground when a Cedar Ridge security truck pulled up behind me. Vanessa climbed out with a uniformed guard and raised her phone. "There he is," she said. "He's tampering with HOA infrastructure." The guard's name tag read Evan. Judging by the way he studied the property markers, he understood there was more to the situation than Vanessa had told him. "Ma'am," he said, "is this parcel owned by the association?" Vanessa answered before I could. "The HOA has emergency access rights. He has been warned not to interfere." She held her phone close to my face. "Daniel, step away from the pipe." I kept both hands visible. "I'm standing on parcel 18442. My name is on the deed. The pipe was installed without my permission." Vanessa turned toward Evan. "You see? He's refusing a direct safety instruction." Evan looked uncomfortable. "I'm private security, Mrs. Cole. I can't order a property owner off his own land." Her expression hardened. "Then call the sheriff." She had already called. 10 minutes later, a county patrol vehicle came down the service road. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped out, listened to Vanessa for less than a minute, then asked each of us to speak separately. Vanessa told him I had threatened the workers, damaged HOA equipment, and attempted to shut down a legally authorized drought project. I gave him the yellow violation notice, my driver's license, a copy of the deed stored on my phone, and the latest county survey. Then I showed him the video of her crew cutting my chain. Deputy Mills watched the clip twice. "Did you authorize these men to enter?" he asked. "No." "Did you touch the pump?" "No." "Did you threaten anyone?" The cameras recorded the entire morning. Vanessa interrupted from several yards away. "The HOA has a recorded water management easement." Deputy Mills turned toward her. "Do you have a copy?" She pulled a folded document from her clipboard. It looked official from a distance. It had a legal description, stamped pages, and what appeared to be my father's signature at the bottom. For the first time that day, I felt genuine uncertainty. My father had signed old access agreements with utility crews. It was possible Vanessa had found something I had forgotten. But when Deputy Mills handed me the copy, 3 details stood out. The parcel number was wrong. The notary block was incomplete, and the signature claimed to be my father's had been dated 18 months after he died. I said nothing about that last detail. Not yet. Instead, I photographed every page and returned the document. Deputy Mills told Vanessa the sheriff's office would not remove me from property recorded in my name. He also warned both sides not to damage or alter anything until the access rights were reviewed. Vanessa smiled tightly. "That's fine. Our attorneys will handle it. Then she pointed at the pump operator. Keep it running. Deputy Mills looked back at her. I just advised everyone not to alter the site. We're not altering it, Vanessa said. We're maintaining essential infrastructure. The operator increased the throttle. Water surged through the black pipe toward the golf course. Vanessa believed the photocopied easement protected her. She didn't realize she had just handed me evidence bearing the signature of a dead man. And once I opened my father's safe, the forged date became the smallest problem the HOA had. The safe sat beneath a workbench in the back room. I had not opened it since the week after my father's funeral. Inside were old tax records, survey maps, utility agreements, and folders tied with cotton string. Most smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. I found the water file near the bottom. The first document was the original certificate for the spring. It confirmed that the right to use and protect the water belonged to the parcel now recorded in my name. The certificate was older than Cedar Ridge, older than the golf course, and older than every house Vanessa claimed to represent. The second document was a county map showing the spring, the wet meadow, and the natural channel leaving my property. There was no HOA easement. There had never been one. Then I found a letter from the State Wildlife Office dated 12 years earlier. My father had contacted them after noticing clusters of eggs beneath the reeds each spring. A biologist visited the property, documented the site, and confirmed that the wet meadow supported a locally protected frog population. The letter was clear. Any activity that reduced flow, disturbed the breeding pools, or altered the surrounding wetland required environmental review before work began. Vanessa had done all three. At the bottom of the folder was a photograph of my father kneeling beside one of the shallow pools, holding a measuring board while a biologist took notes. On the back he had written, "Protect the flow and the rest will return." I set the photograph beside the easement and compared the signatures. My father's real signature leaned forward and ended with a long stroke beneath his last name. The signature on Vanessa's document was slow, uneven, and dated 18 months after his death. I called Dr. Laura Chen, the biologist whose name appeared on the old report. She had retired from the state but still consulted on habitat restoration projects. When I explained what had happened, she asked one question. How low is the water now? Almost 6 inches below normal. There was a pause. Don't let anyone disturb the pools. I'm coming this afternoon. By the time she arrived, the spring had weakened into a narrow ribbon. Laura stepped into the meadow wearing rubber boots and carrying sample tubes, flags, and a field notebook. Within 10 minutes, she found exposed egg masses along the edge of the upper pool. Several had already dried. She looked toward the pump line. This isn't just unauthorized water use, she said. They're actively damaging a protected breeding site. She photographed the mud, the stranded fish, and the collapsed bank near the trench. Before leaving, she placed bright red flags around the most sensitive area and posted a temporary habitat warning. I asked whether the HOA could claim it had not known. Laura looked at the torn ground, the missing boundary stakes, and the intake pipe hidden beneath the reeds. They can claim anything, she said. The question is what they do after they've been formally warned. We got our answer less than an hour later. Vanessa returned with Marcus. She saw the red flags. She read the warning. Then she ordered the crew to pull every flag out of the ground and increase the pump speed before sunset. I reached the meadow as one of the contractors removed the final marker. This sign has no enforcement authority, Vanessa said. Dr. Chen documented protected breeding pools. You've been formally warned. Shut down the pump. Vanessa looked toward the golf course, where the irrigation pond was finally beginning to rise. The board's attorneys will decide what is protected. The board's attorneys don't issue environmental permits. She turned toward Marcus. Increase the flow until the pond reaches operating level. Marcus hesitated. You heard what the biologist said. I heard a retired consultant make an allegation on private property. My private property, I said. Vanessa ignored me. Marcus adjusted the pump. The engine deepened into a heavy roar, and the black pipe jumped as more water surged toward the course. I recorded everything. That evening, Vanessa posted a message to every HOA resident. She described me as an uncooperative neighboring landowner, attempting to withhold a shared resource during a drought. She claimed the spring was ordinary runoff. She said no protected wildlife had been verified, and she warned that my actions could force the board to impose a special assessment on every homeowner. By the following morning, strangers were leaving messages on my voicemail. Some called me selfish. One man said I was holding the golf course hostage. Another told me no one should be allowed to damage hundreds of property values over a puddle and a few frogs. Vanessa had given the community a villain. She had simply chosen the wrong one. While she worked on public opinion, I worked on measurements. Every 4 hours, I photographed the marked stone beside the spring. I recorded the flow rate, water temperature, pump noise, and condition of the breeding pools. The evidence worsened by the hour. The upper pool lost another 3 inches. Small fish became trapped in isolated pockets. Sediment covered sections of clean gravel. The shallow well beside my workshop began drawing air whenever the pump reached full speed. Then Laura called. She had confirmed that several egg masses were destroyed and was submitting an emergency report to the State Wildlife Division. My attorney sent Vanessa a written demand to stop pumping immediately. The letter listed the water rights certificate, unauthorized entry, altered channel, protected habitat, and suspected forged easement. It was delivered at 10:08 that morning. At 10:31, my camera recorded Vanessa standing beside the intake pipe with Marcus. She held the letter in one hand. With the other, she pointed toward the pump and said, "Run it continuously until the tournament. We can deal with the paperwork afterward." That sentence changed everything. Until then, Vanessa could have claimed confusion, bad advice, or an honest boundary dispute. Now she had acknowledged the warning and ordered the damage to continue. I saved the recording, printed the delivery receipt, and added both to the file on my kitchen table. Then I began preparing 4 evidence packages. 1 for the State Water Authority, 1 for the Wildlife Division, 1 for the county, and 1 for the agency Vanessa should have feared from the beginning. I did not send an angry email. Anger was easy to dismiss. A documented timeline was not. The first section contained the deed, the water rights certificate, and the county survey showing that the spring, wet meadow, and intake point were entirely inside my property line. The second contained the wildlife records, my father's correspondence, Laura's updated report, photographs of the exposed egg masses, and measurements showing how quickly the pools had fallen. The third documented the trespass. I included video of the contractors cutting my chain, removing the survey stakes, hiding the original intake pipe, and returning with Vanessa after midnight. The fourth section covered what happened after the warning. There was the cease and desist letter, the delivery receipt, the habitat notice, and the recording of Vanessa ordering Marcus to continue pumping until the tournament. Finally, I included the easement she had given Deputy Mills. I placed my father's real signature beside the one on Vanessa's document and highlighted the date 18 months after his death. At the front of every package, I added a 1-page summary. It did not accuse Vanessa of fraud. It did not exaggerate the damage. It simply listed the facts, coordinates, dates, and agencies whose jurisdiction might apply. At 8:12 the next morning, I submitted the first package to the State Water Authority. At 8:19, the second went to the Wildlife Division. At 8:27, I sent the County Environmental Office its copy. The last package went to the EPA Regional Complaint System because the trench had discharged sediment into a wetland channel connected to downstream water. Then I waited. Not passively. I kept recording the flow. I photographed the pump from the same angle each morning and evening, and I saved every message Vanessa posted to the neighborhood portal. By noon, the Wildlife Division had acknowledged Laura's emergency report. An hour later, the State Water Office requested the pump's model number and estimated withdrawal rate. At 3:40, an EPA compliance officer called. He asked whether the trench was still carrying sediment. Yes. Is the pump still operating? I held the phone near the open kitchen window. The engine could be heard across the meadow. Yes. There was a pause while he typed. Do not confront the operator. Continue documenting the site. Someone will contact you about access. That evening, Vanessa posted photographs of the golf course pond rising. She called the project a success. She thanked the board for acting decisively when one neighboring property owner refused to cooperate. 43 residents reacted with applause. Then, just before midnight, an email arrived from an address I did not recognize. The subject line read, "You need to see where the money came from." The sender identified herself as Susan Bell, Cedar Ridge's assistant treasurer. She attached 3 invoices an emergency expenditure form, and board minutes Vanessa had never posted publicly. Her message contained only 2 sentences. The board never voted on this project. Vanessa approved the contract herself. Cole Environmental Solutions belongs to her brother. Susan asked me not to call her. Vanessa monitored board communications and had already accused 2 directors of leaking confidential information. So we exchanged documents through a secure folder. The first invoice from Cole Environmental Solutions was for $22,000. It described the work as an emergency groundwater stabilization project. There was no groundwater involved. The second invoice charged $14,000 for environmental permitting. No permits had been requested. The third billed $12,000 for a preliminary engineering study that appeared to consist of 3 pages copied from an old county drought report. The total came to $48,000, the exact amount Vanessa had approved during the closed emergency session. But that was not the worst part. Susan sent me the bank transfer. The money had not come from the landscaping budget. Vanessa had taken it from a reserve fund designated for repairs to Cedar Ridge's aging fire suppression system. Several hydrants near the west entrance had failed their latest pressure tests. The board had delayed those repairs because Vanessa claimed the association lacked sufficient funds. She had diverted money meant for emergency safety into a project that diverted my water into her golf course. Susan also included an internal email from Marcus. He warned Vanessa that the intake appeared to be outside HOA property and that the spring might require state approval. Her reply was 6 words: "Do the work. I'll handle Daniel." Another message instructed him to describe the pipe as temporary, even though the plans called for burying it beneath the fairway permanently. Vanessa had not made one desperate decision during a drought. She had planned the project, hidden the cost, ignored the boundary, and created paperwork to make it appear legitimate afterward. I forwarded the financial records to my attorney and added them to the agency files. Susan agreed to provide the original emails if investigators requested them, but she wanted one thing in return. "Don't let Vanessa blame the homeowners," she wrote. "Most of them never knew." I understood. The residents cheering Vanessa's online posts believed she had saved their golf course. They had no idea their fire safety reserve had been handed to her brother. The next morning, Cedar Ridge maintenance crews placed banners around the clubhouse for the charity tournament. Temporary bleachers went up beside the 18th green. A local real estate company installed a sponsor tent overlooking the irrigation pond. Vanessa posted a photograph of herself standing on the restored fairway. Her caption read, "Leadership means acting before others understand why." She was right about one thing. Most people still did not understand what she had done. But the agencies did. At 4:18 that afternoon, the State Water Authority emailed me an inspection notice. EPA compliance staff would join them. The Wildlife Division was sending an investigator. They wanted access to the spring at 9 o'clock Friday morning. The same morning Vanessa's tournament was scheduled to begin. I sent them the gate code and one additional document, a map showing exactly where the buried pipe crossed beneath the 18th fairway. Vanessa had spent $48,000 making the golf course green for her biggest public event. Now that green strip would lead the inspectors directly to her. Friday morning arrived bright, dry, and almost windless. From the edge of my meadow, I could hear music drifting from the Cedar Ridge clubhouse. Golf carts moved between sponsor tents, volunteers arranged gift bags, and a photographer followed Vanessa across the 18th green. The fairway looked unnaturally perfect. 3 weeks earlier, it had been brown. Now it was deep green because my spring was still being pumped beneath it. At 8:56, the first government vehicle stopped beside my gate. 2 more arrived behind it. The inspection team included a state water officer, an EPA compliance specialist, a wildlife investigator, and a county environmental engineer. Laura joined us carrying her field report. I showed them the original channel first. The upper pool had fallen low enough to expose mud around the reeds. Several breeding pockets were dry, and sediment from the excavated trench had spread downstream. The state officer photographed the intake pipe and checked the pump's serial number. The EPA specialist collected samples from the muddy discharge. Then the county engineer unfolded my survey map. "Where does this pipe terminate?" he asked. I pointed through the trees. "Under the 18th fairway, then into the golf course irrigation pond." We followed it. The buried line left a faint ridge beneath the grass. It crossed the service road, passed behind decorative shrubs, and continued directly toward the tournament. Golfers began turning to watch as 5 inspectors stepped onto the course wearing agency vests. Vanessa noticed us from beside the sponsor tent. Her smile disappeared. She walked across the green quickly, still holding a microphone from her opening remarks. "This is a private HOA event," she said. "You cannot disrupt the tournament without authorization." The state officer showed her his credentials. "We are conducting an inspection of an unauthorized water diversion." Vanessa looked at me. "This is harassment. Daniel has been trying to sabotage this community for weeks." The EPA specialist pointed toward the irrigation pond. "Is that pond receiving water from the spring north of this property?" "Our contractor manages the system." That wasn't the question. Vanessa lowered the microphone. "The association has a legal easement." She produced the same photocopied document she had shown Deputy Mills. The county engineer examined it, then opened the official land records on his tablet. This easement was never recorded. It's an older private agreement. The parcel number belongs to land 3 miles east of here. Vanessa glanced toward Marcus, who was standing beside the pump controls near the pond. He began backing away. The wildlife investigator placed Laura's photographs on a folding table. "These were taken after your association received written notice of a protected breeding site. Did you order the pumping to continue?" Vanessa's face tightened. "I relied on professional advice." Marcus spoke before she could say more. "She told me the permits were handled." Every nearby conversation stopped. The county engineer followed the pipe to the pond inlet and ordered the system shut down. Marcus hesitated. Vanessa whispered something to him. The EPA specialist heard it. "Do not touch or alter the equipment except under our direction." A maintenance worker shut off the main switch. The pump noise faded across the course. For the first time in weeks, the meadow behind my house went quiet. Then Susan Bell stepped out from the crowd carrying a blue folder. She placed it on the inspection table. Inside were the invoices, the unapproved bank transfer, the contractor emails, and Vanessa's message. "Do the work. I'll handle Daniel." Susan looked directly at the other board members. "You never voted on this," she said, "and the money came from the fire safety reserve." The board attorney opened the first invoice and stopped reading halfway down the page. Residents gathered around the table. The same people who had applauded Vanessa's posts were now watching inspectors place red seals on the pumps that had made their golf course green. The state officer handed Vanessa a temporary compliance order. She looked at the first page, then at the cameras and phones surrounding her. "This is not final," she said. "No," the officer replied. "This is the part where the daily penalties begin if the association refuses to comply." The order required Cedar Ridge to stop withdrawing water immediately. But shutting off the pump was only the first step. The HOA had 72 hours to submit a restoration plan, secure the damaged channel, protect the remaining breeding pools, and hire an independent environmental contractor. If it failed to comply, the order authorized penalties of up to $10,000 for every additional day the violation continued. Vanessa read that number twice. Then she turned toward the board attorney. "They can't fine the entire community for one contractor's mistake." The attorney closed Susan's folder. "This was not the contractor's decision. Your signature is on the expenditure. Your emails ordered the work to continue after receiving notice." Vanessa pointed at Marcus. "He told me the intake was legal." Marcus shook his head. "I told you we needed permits." Vanessa tried one final argument. "The golf course would have died. I acted to protect property values." The state officer looked toward the muddy water line surrounding the damaged spring. "You diverted water from property you did not own, altered a protected habitat, and continued after written warning. A golf tournament does not create emergency authority." The board suspended Vanessa before the inspectors left. By the following morning, Cedar Ridge had hired an environmental law firm, a restoration engineer, and a licensed wetland contractor. The first estimate exceeded $180,000. That did not include legal fees, the missing fire reserve money, damage to my property, or the daily penalties that would begin if the deadline passed. For weeks, Vanessa had described my spring as a free resource. Now every gallon she had taken carried a price. At sunset, an inspector placed a red notice on the locked pump controls. Across the top, in letters large enough to read from the clubhouse, were 3 words: unauthorized water diversion. The fairway was still green. But everyone at Cedar Ridge finally understood what had paid for it. 3 days later, the excavators returned. This time, they were not working for Vanessa. A licensed restoration crew entered through my gate, under the supervision of the State Water Authority. Environmental monitors marked the original spring channel, photographed every disturbed section, and installed temporary barriers around the surviving breeding pools. Then another crew moved on to the 18th fairway. Tournament banners still hung beside the clubhouse when the first strip of turf was peeled back. Underneath it lay the black pipe Vanessa had paid her brother to bury. Residents gathered along the cart path as workers cut the line into sections and lifted it from the ground. What Vanessa had called a temporary emergency measure ran nearly 800 feet beneath the golf course. It had been built to stay. By noon, the fairway looked like a construction trench. The irrigation pond began falling again, but the spring slowly started to rise. On my property, crews removed the hidden intake, stabilized the damaged bank, replaced contaminated gravel, and rebuilt the shallow pools according to Laura's restoration plan. Native willow, sedge, and wetland grass were planted along the channel. Every stage had to be photographed and approved before the next could begin. The HOA paid for all of it. The restoration estimate passed $200,000 before legal fees or damages were included. Cole Environmental Solutions lost the contract and became the subject of a separate investigation into false invoices and unpermitted work. Vanessa resigned before the board could formally remove her. She claimed the community had abandoned her after she tried to save the golf course. But Susan released the meeting records. Residents saw that Vanessa had never asked for their approval. She had taken money from the fire safety reserve, hired her brother, ignored multiple warnings, and used a forged easement to justify the project. A month later, the 18th fairway was still covered in bare soil and restoration fencing. Beside the cart path stood a large red notice explaining why the ground had been opened. Golfers could not avoid it. Neither could Vanessa's former neighbors. She had wanted a perfectly green course to prove her leadership. Instead, she left behind an 800-foot scar showing exactly where her authority had ended. By the following spring, the scar across my meadow had begun to disappear. The rebuilt channel held steady through the winter rains. Willow roots secured the banks, native grass covered the disturbed soil, and the upper pools filled to their original depth. One April morning, Laura called me down to the spring. Beneath the reeds were fresh clusters of frog eggs. My father had been right. Protect the flow, and the rest would return. Cedar Ridge elected a new board, completed an independent financial audit, and restored the money taken from the fire safety reserve. Emergency spending now required multiple signatures. Major contracts had to be disclosed to residents, and no HOA project could cross private property without recorded permission. The golf course survived too. It switched to drought-resistant grass, reduced the irrigated acreage, and began collecting and reusing water instead of searching for someone else's source to take. I never joined the HOA. I never sold them access to the spring. But I allowed Laura to bring local students to the meadow twice a year to study the restored habitat. Vanessa believed a title, a clipboard, and an emergency resolution gave her the right to move water wherever she wanted. She was wrong. The spring had a deed. The habitat had a record, and every midnight shovel had been caught on camera. Real authority does not come from speaking the loudest. It comes from knowing where the boundary is and keeping the documents that prove it. So tell me this. If an HOA secretly diverted water from your property, would you warn them one last time? Or would you let the inspectors follow the pipe all the way back to the golf course?